But I think, look, I would say, and I did a blog post on this a few days ago, and some top tips for establishing a great global team. And the 5 things, if I can remember them, that I said were, firstly, realize that everybody sees the world through their own lens. So when you have a team that's coming from elsewhere, they're probably not going to see the world the same way as you. They have different values, different expectations. You have to be okay with that. You can't start out thinking, well, my way is right. We all want to.
Cynthia, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. Really lovely to have you on the show today.
Great to be here.
I want to kick off like I do with all of my guests. You are already aware with our vision to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of SMEs to scale with purpose. So what does scaling with purpose mean to you, Cynthia?
So look, for me, it really means that when we help a company to scale internationally, we deliver 3 things for the founder, for the team, and for the people who are receiving that product or service. Firstly, we want to create money for the founder and the team, because you don't do these things for free. Secondly, we want to create impact, because we know that when people trade and do great work across borders, they can actually change people's lives very dramatically. So that impact piece is super important. And thirdly, freedom. So, we are encouraging people to create businesses which actually facilitate the life that they're hoping to live, rather than chaining them to a desk 80 hours a week. So in a nutshell, it's that: money, impact, and freedom.
Lovely. I really like that. Really like that. I mean, we shared a little bit in the intro about your background. You worked with the British and US governments in Iraq to restart the economy and get businesses and government working again after 30 years of isolation and a decade of war. Could you share with our listeners some insights of that, what sounds like an incredible experience, especially in the context of scaling internationally?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I'll give you a tiny bit of backstory, because to be honest, I did not really ever set out with this grand plan to be in Iraq. Far from it. 2003, I was working for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I was posted in Egypt, and I was just about to move across to a posting in the United Arab Emirates. And I got a call from Canberra saying, hey, we need somebody to basically, fill a position in Iraq. Can you do it? And I just had a pretty rough year in Egypt. I was also following the news at that stage. Stuff was blowing up, like the UN had just blown up. And I was like, hell no, I'm going to my nice cushy posting in the UAE. And I turned it down. 3 years later, kind of September 2006, I was just finishing up a master's at SOAS in London. And I was sitting, I don't know if you remember, there was a protest against the war in Lebanon, wear white, and we sat outside 10 Downing Street for an afternoon. I chatted to my friend Glada from Chatham House, and I said, hey, Glada, I'm finishing up my master's, and I kind of think I should go back to the region for a while so I can credibly say that I do Middle East stuff. What do you reckon? And she's like, oh, I know some people you should talk to. I was in their office on a Monday, or I think I wrote an email on a Monday. I was in the office on a Tuesday, and I got a job offer on a Wednesday. And so suddenly, a couple of weeks after finishing a master's, I was catapulted into working firstly in the Prime Minister's office in Iraq, and trying to help them sort out protocol and just how to make an office function. It sounds super glamorous. To be honest, it was kind of basic, and I just had to make stuff up as I went along. And I did 4 projects in Iraq over about 3.5 or 4 years. One was 4 months, one was 6 weeks, and then there were about 2 of a year and a half. And in between, I was like going back and forth to the UK and to Australia. And the kind of common theme there was that you had to make something out of nothing. You just be thrown a problem in an environment where nothing worked. There were no landlines because they'd all been blown up. There were no faxes. They'd all been blown up. There were mobile phones, but they got jammed every time, some rockets or mortars came in, which was all the time. Like our counterparts in the Iraqi government, which is who I was working with, shared email addresses, and often the power in their buildings would go down, the power at home would go down, so they couldn't access the email. So it was an incredibly difficult environment. It was like something, it was not quite on a par with what you're seeing in Iraq at the moment, because it was post-conflict, that was not live fire and fighting all the time, but it was an environment where most things had been destroyed, and we had to go on trying to function on the same schedule as people in London or then Washington, DC said they needed, and trying to make stuff happen. And so, look, I think I became very resourceful at that point, and I learned how to kind of show up and see a problem and turn around and say, is there a precedent? Have we done this before? And I'd get told, no, there's no precedent. Like, are you stupid? Of course there's no precedent. Just fix it. Just like make it happen. And I would be sitting there with a slow internet connection, Googling like whatever the thing was, trying to figure out how the hell I make this thing happen. And I did various forms of that for 4 years. And look, it's not directly transferable, but I think if you are doing a startup, particularly in a new area that isn't something that people know a lot about, or that's kind of on the cutting edge, or you're doing a scale up, there really is some of that. You know, you're being faced with problems all the time that there is not a cookie cutter answer to. And you have to just find a solution. You know, you have to show up, find the solution, and think outside the box. And the challenges will be different. I mean, thankfully, most business owners have got functioning email and phone and electricity and internet. But on the other hand, they're not getting paid. Their money doesn't drop into their account every second week. And if they screw it up, then they're gone and the business is gone. So different challenges, but there is some stuff that I think kind of transfers from one environment to the other.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of entrepreneurs and leaders listening who will relate to making and having to make something out of nothing. And this is especially, it relates especially to my own experience, certainly of developing the business on an international scale, where what was available to you in home markets and you could quickly take for granted, like the infrastructure, wasn't available in other markets. And so no doubt an amazing experience. It would be remiss of me on the backdrop of International Women's Day not to acknowledge the fact that you became the first female CEO of the Australian Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry in 2010. Can you share with the listeners some of the learnings from that experience, and especially female leaders? We see in our own programs, you know, the number of female leaders versus the males is probably about 10%. So appeal to the female leaders out there as to the benefits of putting yourself forward for a CEO role.
Can I speak out of school?
Go ahead.
Well, look, I'll tell you, and then you can edit this however you like,
Absolutely.
Right? Look, I came back to Australia after 12 years away, the last 4 of which are in Iraq. And I came back to Australia, and look, I came back with some pretty significant experience. I'm a lawyer by training. I've been working as a diplomat. I was a fast track grad. So I was in like a top very small percent of people who got into a department. And I had experience putting, well, it was a qualified success, but trying to put the economy of a country back together. So it had some pretty cutting edge experience. And I came back to Australia, which is, to be fair, a pretty parochial market. And people looked at my CV and said, wow, awesome CV. We have no idea what to do with you. Next. And I was like, oh, this is turning out to be pretty interesting. So look, I was asked to apply for this role of CEO of a Chamber of Commerce, and I did it. And, you know, I probably got it mainly because I'd had so much experience in the Middle East, and because I'm an Arabic speaker. And I kind of got that job despite being female rather than because of it, I would have to say. I'm really proud of the work that I did in that role. But I mean, at the time, and this is 10 years ago now, I dealt with an all-male board, kind of older on the whole, fairly fixed in their way of thinking. And to be honest, look, I found it a struggle because I wanted to kind of move out fast and break things. And they wanted to do like, oh, you can't spend more than 20 cents on stuff. And so I found that difficult. And look, I didn't get everything right either, because that was my first kind of role as a CEO. And so I didn't have probably the experience that I needed to manage a board. It was pretty challenging, though, I'd have to say. I mean, my big tip for women thinking of going for CEO roles is to try and, if you're going to be a CEO, try and get your board to approve that you get a CEO coach. Doesn't mean like that you're a dummy. All the best players have coaches. I was not lucky enough to be allowed to have a CEO coach because my organization didn't have that much money. But I think if I had a CEO coach and maybe a board that was a little more flexible, maybe I would still be the CEO of that organization. I want to say though, I'm pretty proud of the stuff that we did. So, I mean, it kind of went from being not very well known about to nationally recognized. And we did 2 international conferences where we got government ministers, you know, trade ministers from around the Arab world and Australian government ministers to fly in and actually show up and do stuff. And I guess, look, that was my first real experience of running a business. So I went from diplomacy, which is very much, you know, government, play by the rules, tick all the boxes, to professional services, which is not usually move fast and break things, but it was, because it was Iraq and we just had to make stuff happen, but a lot more leeway and a lot more creativity. Then back to industry association, where there was never enough resources to do the things that you wanted to do. And you were always trying to do more and more with less resources. And so that was probably one of the key things that made me eventually think, wow, this is kind of not my environment. Like, I don't want to have to keep doing more and more and more with less. You know, that's very hard for me to get my head around. I'm finding this exhausting. And so I bugged out, only to discover that when you start your own business, that's pretty much what you're doing anyway for a period of time. It's like, oh, I didn't realize it was going to be like this. But yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from that role.
It's sage advice in terms of the recommendation for all CEOs, and especially those newly appointed, to get a coach. I'm a huge advocate of that. And especially when you think that everyone, certainly in the professional sporting environment, has a coach. It's just the paradigm within that industry now. You get yourself a coach and a mentor. Thankfully, it's becoming more common in business. And it's especially important when you think that sports person's success or failure affects 1 or 2 people. The CEO's success or failure impacts hundreds, if not thousands, when you take in the direct employees, all of the stakeholders and their customers. So brilliant advice. What do you know now that you wish you had known then going into the role?
You need to make friends with everybody on the board individually. You need to cultivate a personal relationship with every single person on the board. Because if you don't do that, what happens, and this is not, I mean, I have been on a number of boards since then, but when you put people into groups, strange things happen in terms of group dynamics. And it's easy, I mean, especially if you have a scenario like I did, where I had an all-male board and I was the girl CEO, and I really was the girl CEO, because I was 33 when I went to that role, and everybody else started at like 45 and went up to, I don't know, just shy of 80. If you don't do that, group dynamics kind of dictate that you are going to be the minority that gets picked on. And look, that can happen. I've seen that even happen in other boards that I was on the board, where there was a CEO, and that CEO, like me, didn't know that you really need to go around and cultivate a very personal relationship with everybody on the board so that you can wield a level of influence with everyone. I'm sure that is not the standard advice that gets handed out. You know, I've done the company directors course and I don't remember that being in it, but you know, that always talks about how the chair and the CEO need to get on and have a good relationship. And I think that's important, but I think in order to do well as a CEO, you kind of have to have tabs on everybody who is in the board at some level so that you've got influence with them as well. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to get your own way, and that sometimes that is appropriate. You're not always going to be right as the CEO. And sometimes the board is going to have other ideas than the ideas that you have. But you want, when you have board members making decisions about things that you've proposed or things that you've said, as a CEO, you want them to be doing it from a place where they know you as a person, they like you, and they trust your judgment. You don't want to be doing it from a position where they don't really know you and they're kind of suspicious about who you are and what your motivations are.
Brilliant advice. And we're emotional creatures, so it makes absolute sense to cultivate those relationships amongst your leadership team. It goes, you know, even beyond the board. So that's wonderful advice. Getting into your book, Cynthia, and congratulations, this is your 2nd book. I have a copy here for those listening, Business Beyond Borders, Take Your Company Global, which aligns really nicely to our 8th principle within our ScaleX framework, place. I'm interested, first of all, what inspired you to write it?
Look, I think, I've been kind of thinking about this question because we are officially launching the book next week in Sydney and Melbourne, and I've had to think about, okay, what am I going to say about this book? I think I had the idea for the book itself back in 2014 which was when I first started my company, but we were heavily focused on the Middle East because that was what I'd done for a decade. I think though that probably the real genesis of the thing was, for me, was back in 1999 when I was an intern at the Australian Embassy in Paris working at Austrade, so working in our trade facilitation organization, where I saw Australian companies trying to come to the French market, as particularly in the education space, and just realizing that there were so many things that they didn't know. And I looked at how government tried to do it, and I could see that despite government's best attempts at it, there were kind of gaps. And then as I went on, you know, and I was working representing the Australian government in the Middle East, and then working as a management consultant, trying to get Iraq's economy restarted, and seeing companies from all over the world coming and trying to set up, I could see so many opportunities everywhere. You know, I was traveling during that whole time throughout the Middle East, throughout Asia, throughout Europe, and everywhere I'd go, I'd kind of spot opportunities and think you could do this thing here or that thing. And then realize that, you know, there were gaps in what I knew about how you would do it. There were gaps, and I could see other people making stupid mistakes as they tried to set things up. And so I kind of came to this realization over a period of time that there were enormous opportunities for people to scale internationally, but there was no real end-to-end blueprint on how to do it. I mean, it's a vast field of knowledge, right? Yeah. It's kind of a struggle to think you could ever cover it end-to-end as a single person, but there are kind of building blocks that you need along the way where you can say, okay, here are all the areas that you need to cover off. And so that is really what I wanted to do with the book. And the cool thing about it is I've even learned so much stuff as I wrote it. And, you know, now I'm flicking through it at the moment thinking, probably we're going to need a second and third edition. So I'm saying to everybody, if you read the book and you think that I missed something, it's really egregious, or even just something you're curious about that I didn't put in, please send me a note. I promise I will keep a note of all the comments, and I will reference them and then incorporate them when I go to do the next edition.
It's certainly held a mirror up to me in terms of highlighting and illuminating a lot of the mistakes that we made in my previous role as CEO of a business that scaled internationally and became an industry leader. We actually established offices in six continents, and I recognize and can relate to, I wish I'd had this book, but I recognize and relate to everything that's in there, but I wish I'd had it back in 2006, 2007. So
can I ask a question?
Sure.
What would be your key mistake? Like, what's the key thing that you recognize that you think, I wish we'd done this differently? I'm curious.
Yeah. So, and I'll ask you about this. I was going to ask, how do we avoid shiny new client syndrome? So what we tended to do was react to the inquiries that came into the business. Yeah. And we became number one in a number of the different Middle East markets, but we didn't set out to become a significant player in the Middle East market. We responded to an inquiry that came in, and that inquiry turned into a project, and it ended up that it consumed so much of our resources for about 5 or 6 years that we didn't have the capacity to explore other, let's say, easier markets like North America. North America was the last market for us to establish, and if I was to do it again, it would have been the first. So how do we avoid shiny new client syndrome?
Oh, look, it's a great question. I see this all the time with my clients, and look, and we've seen it over the years, and we wondered, how do we combat this? Because we teach people techniques for market selection, but more recently, what we've started to do is that when people join our accelerator, we do a market ranking report for them, and we say, okay, tell us, what are your top 5 markets that you're thinking of going to? Where do you think you see the most potential? And then we actually get them to tell us about those. And then we ask questions around about 30 indicators, and we run it through big data sets. Right. And we basically spit out a report, which is based on hard data, like it's completely objective. And people say, where do you think I should go? And I'm like, I don't have a preference. I don't really care where you go, as long as it's the right place for you. We want you to base the decision on data. So the report will come out and it says, here are the markets ranked 1 to 5 in terms of level of scope of opportunity, level of risk, where's the competition, where are you probably going to make the most profit, what are the trends in the various markets in terms of what exports are going there, what are the keywords that are coming out on Twitter. And that just provides a level of clarity for people, because suddenly they're sitting there with a report that says, we're not saying you have to go to any of these markets, but here are how they break out on the basis of data. And then I encourage the clients to really triangulate what is in the report with their own experience and their own, what they know about the market. So, you might have, I don't know, let's just take an example. US is number 1, Japan is number 2, Singapore is number 3, and I don't know, Spain is number 4. But you know more about Japan because you went to university there, or you have family members, or you already did some business deals. And so you look at it and say, well, logically, the US might be number 1, but I don't know anybody there. And so, the metrics say that Japan is going to be more profitable. It's not as large as the States, but it's going to be more profitable. It's not too risky on these different metrics. And hey, I already have great connections. I'm going to go there. So I really encourage people to make the decision on one, external data, and then triangulate that with their personal experience and where they see their strengths.
Yeah, again, great advice. And just exploring that a little bit further, Cynthia, what do you recommend? Is it a machine gun approach, or is it very, very calculated in terms of kind of 1 or 2 key markets and really focusing on those for, 1, 2, 3 years? And once you've got traction in those, then look to expand it. What's the approach?
Laser beam, not fire hose, for sure.
Right.
Because think about it, every time you open a market on some level, it's almost like starting the business over again. Yeah. I mean, the product probably, maybe not, unless you need to modify it for the market, but the packaging, the regulatory and compliance, the marketing, almost for sure, your awareness of the culture, how the sales process might work and need to be tweaked. And if you think about entering one market as, starting, I don't know if you do it in Ireland, but in Australia, we light fires with magnifying glasses when we're kids. And you hold the magnifying glass over a little pile of kindling and twigs, and after a while, there's enough sunlight that it bursts into flame. Does that happen up your way, or is it too wet? It can happen, right?
It does, but we don't get the sunshine that often for it to happen. But I have an occasion as a kid enjoyed that on the rare day that the sun did come out.
It's a lot of work, isn't it, to get that tiny fire going?
Absolutely.
So can you imagine if you got the tiny fire going, and then one fire represents one market, and then you suddenly have to open 5 more markets, and you're trying to keep all your little fires going with your one magnifying glass. What I'm saying here is it just disperses your energy and your resources way too thinly, and it reduces the possibility that you're going to do an awesome job. And so that's why I like to insist on, okay, let's make a decision on the data first. Let's say what the data says about where the best market is going to be, and then let's go for that. I mean, if somebody comes and says, hey, I want to do China first, if they've never done an international project before, I'm usually trying to steer them away from that to something easier in the region, like, for example, Singapore, which, although it is smaller and has less potential as a market in its own right, is much easier, because what we want to do is increase the likelihood of success on the first attempt. Because if somebody goes in and gets burned and has a horrible experience and wrecks their reputation, the odds of them trying again are much, much lower, because it leaves a very bitter taste when you fail. And, you've usually wasted a bunch of energy and a bunch of money, and you've burned up a bunch of other opportunities. So we want to try and get the first project to succeed and do something that's modest, and then build on that.
And what are the key ingredients or key components that should be existent in a potential new market that the leadership of the SMEs who have a desire to expand should really look out for? So beyond the accelerator report, the accelerator report that you guys run, in terms of the data that from that prospective market, what are the fundamental things that should be existent?
Look, I mean, if you wanted to break it down to its simplest, if you can imagine a Venn diagram of 3 circles, it's really the overlap between opportunity, so market size, least risk, and profitability. And that's where you have low risk, big size of market, and high potential profitability. That's kind of what you're looking for. So, or to put it another way, you want to actually know that people in that market need and want to buy what you have at the price point that you want to offer it for.
Let's just dig into that a little bit further, because the intersection of those 3 circles brings me to the wonderful diagram that you have in your book, which is the blueprint for international success. Can you elaborate on that diagram a little bit further, Cynthia?
Yeah, and look, I'm hoping it won't be too hard for people to sort of visualize in their mind, but essentially, I talked about the fact that we're trying to create at the beginning, that we're trying to create money for people, impact and freedom. The next kind of layer out of that is that we want the ingredients for doing that is that we need a great strategy, which I like to call a 10x strategy, on the basis that's probably needs to be 10 times better than what you have at the moment. You also need 10x momentum, because the international space is highly competitive. And so there's no point having an excellent strategy if it sits in the bottom drawer of your desk and doesn't get actioned. It has to be being acted upon, continuously at speed. And then you need money. And, the reason I say that is because usually you're going to need money in order to, actualize the plan that you have in mind. It's not doing an international expansion, unfortunately, is not usually for free. So there has to be some money there to do that. And the money that is flowing into your business has to be managed and maximized so that you have that cash to do the expansion. So those are our three key levers: strategy, momentum, and money. And then on that model, on that blueprint for international success model, there are basically 9 accelerators. So if you think about strategy, what do you need to create a great strategy? You need an expanded vision, so a really big picture, very crystal clear, big picture vision of what you're going to achieve over the next, I usually say 10 years and people freak out. So sometimes I say 5 when they look really horrified, but 5 to 10 years. You need deep insight. So you've got to really understand the markets that you're going to go to. You need to know what makes them tick. What is the market size? What are the dynamics? What's the culture? What is your ideal? Who is your ideal client in that market? What are they expecting? How does what you sell align to that? Can you fulfill their goals, challenges, and desires? And then the third thing you need in that strategy piece is what I like to call a reality check. And that is, do we actually have what it takes to deliver on this expanded vision that we've set up over here? So that's your strategy piece. On your momentum piece, you need to know your numbers. So you need to have complete control of not just your financial numbers, but also your marketing numbers in the business. So, what's your cost of customer acquisition? What's your lifetime value? Take it down to the granularity. If we're going to run lead ads in Thailand, how much is it going to cost us per lead? Is that going to be worthwhile? So you need to know what are all your financial numbers and your marketing metrics. You need to have what I like to call some uncompromising objectives, which are essentially stretch goals that you commit to doing. And you need to have a powerful plan. So you've got your goals, and then you have that plan which says, okay, in order to reach these objectives, here is what we're going to do over the next 12 months, over the next 120 days, and today. What are we working on today that's going to get us to 120 days and then 12 months and 3 years? And then on that last piece, which is money, we need a top team, so a team that's 150% bought into that vision that we have, and a team that has actually the right skills and capacities to take the company global, because there can be some pretty specialized stuff in there. We need super systems. If you don't have super systems all the way through every bit of your business, you will have chaos, and as you scale, you will just scale the chaos. I'm sure you guys talk about that in your program. There's nothing worse than scaling chaos. It's very horrifying. And you need active accountability. So, you need a third party from outside looking over your shoulder, cheering you on, guiding you, giving you feedback on whether that's a great idea or an okay idea or a horrible idea, and also just, holding your feet to the fire to do the things that you committed to do. And those are basically your 9 bits. And when you get, your critical thinking, which is those 3 things I talked about with the vision, and you combine that with the bits, I didn't kind of break it down, but the second 3 things, which are our definite decisions, that gives you strategy. When you combine the definite decisions and the uncompromising execution, that gives you momentum. And then when you do your critical thinking and your extraordinary execution, that gives you the money. That's probably totally confusing for anybody who doesn't have the diagram in front of them, but I'm sure you know what page it is on.
I have the benefit of the book in front of me. I've no doubt that if people want to get a PDF version of this, you would provide that, Cynthia.
Absolutely.
I want to come to something, because this is certainly a challenge that we experienced considerably, was the formation of the top team, the team that you have either seconded in or recruited locally. What is and you address this in the book as well, you know, what are the do's and don'ts of creating a team in that local market?
Look, I mean, it's a huge topic. I guess, look, there are so many ways to go about it. So you just have to think about what risks are you going to, what risks are you prepared to assume? Because if you take somebody from your home team and you put them overseas, that can work really well because they already know you, you know them, you trust them, they know your home business, but they don't know the market. It can be really hard for them to get traction. So that can be a very expensive way of doing it, and it doesn't always work out well. On the flip side, you can get somebody in the market, they know the market really well, but you don't necessarily know them. And so it can be much harder and slower to build trust. And so that, you know, that's a different equation. Then you've got the global virtual team. I have to say, I love that option. That's what we have. And then you have all different permutations of employer of record, contractors, full-time, part-time. So I think you have to think about, you know, what are you trying to achieve and what can you really accommodate? But I think, look, I would say, and I did a blog post on this a few days ago and some top tips for establishing a great global team. And the 5 things, if I can remember them, that I said were, firstly, realize that everybody sees the world through their own lens. So when you have a team that's coming from elsewhere, they're probably not going to see the world the same way as you. They have different values, different expectations. You have to be okay with that. You can't start out thinking, well, my way is right. We all want to think that, but actually nobody's way is really right. Bits of everybody's way is right. So that's the first thing. You have to think that everybody, you've just realized everybody has a different lens. Then you have to stand in the other person's shoes. And if you do that, every time you go to make a decision, you see it from the other person's perspective rather than yours, that really helps. And the example I gave was, you know, if a 9 a.m. meeting for you means a 4 a.m. meeting for your team members, be smart, move the meeting so that you don't have your team members having to get up early every day because you will wear them down. If you've got people working at home or remotely over the long term, and they're going to be alone every day, think about what that is going to do to their mindset and their motivation, and find ways to counteract it so that you get an engaged team, not an isolated, demotivated team. The third thing I said, I think, was to meet daily. And for me, that is like, that's one of the things that we have done that has made our team really tight and really happy and really successful as a team. We don't let our people go for, you know, days or weeks without checking in. We have a Zoom meeting every single morning. And if you're working that day, you have to be on the meeting, even if you have to dial in from the car or whatever, but you need to just show up. And we have different themes for different days. But I mean, that keeps us all on the same page. So I think that constant communication is important. Leverage technology to, you know, to run the team. And I think that's a lot more common than it would have been pre-pandemic. But we use, apart from Zoom, Trello and Slack. So, you know, I have silenced my Slack notifications because otherwise this podcast would just be full of that typing sound on Slack because people are still typing because they're in other countries and they want to know stuff and they're telling me, hey, we did this and that. So that's really important. And we use Trello for workflow management. And then lastly, just celebrate diversity in your global team and look for opportunities. You know, look for opportunities to share things about where you come from. You can make it a formal thing. You don't have to. If you have people from different places in your office, when it's a national day, celebrate it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. We did this. You know, having grown from a very small company, 15 people, to an international company, almost 700 globally. And we brought in quite a number of students who would spend time at head office for, you know, 1 or 2 years and then be seconded back out into those what we call strategic regions. And we always encouraged them to, we celebrated an international week. So for example, the guys from South America, from Brazil, would spend a week and at each lunchtime present a little bit about the culture, bring in some of the food that would be celebrated in Brazil, for example, and we would learn and actively learn about those specific cultures. We actually then took it a step further and held language classes and encouraged those young members of our team from other countries to teach some of the language and help us learn some of the language. So, and really celebrate that and really embrace that. On that note, do you think the need to understand others' cultures is overplayed. I have in my head when I say that old, I think it was an old HSBC ad, and you have the customer meeting with the client, you know, the customer bows and the client puts his hand out, and, you know, it was clearly a visible clash of cultures. Is that overplayed, do you think? And how important is that need to understand the other's culture in terms of actually getting business done?
I think the answer is probably, as I think about this, it depends, right? Because if you are meeting, you know, if I'm an Australian and I'm coming to Ireland and we're going to do business, I'm going to assume, hey, we're pretty much exactly the same. Half the people in Australia are Irish anyway. And, you know, most people like beer and we all speak English, and the weather is a bit different, but it's probably pretty much the same. And we're going to assume that it's just the same. And we're probably going to be wrong. And there's going to be a culture gap that we haven't anticipated. Take it to the other extreme, and I'm somebody who is Australian who is heading off to China for the first time to do business. There will be, if I'm somebody who's not traveled before and doesn't speak Mandarin, it's going to be a very intimidating experience. There'll be so many things that are different, and I will probably be fearful and uncomfortable the whole time. And I'll be like, oh, I'm probably stuffing this up. And so, I mean, it's both. On one hand, there is like a huge gap between cultures, you know, from different places, and on the other hand, Sassy, can you just go out for a minute for me? She's soft, not soft.
That's brilliant.
Soft. Okay, tu as besoin d'un serviette. Va demander papa pour un serviette. Quick. It's like that thing on CNN when the kid came in from South Korea.
That's
sorry.
Brilliant. I was interviewing Miriam Sadivi. It was a couple of months back, and it was exactly the same. She was in the middle of a question, really distracted. Says, "Look, I have to stop. There's notes being passed under the door here," and it was notes from her kids that said, "Mummy, are you putting me to bed tonight?" So brilliant.
That was Saskia saying, "I need a towel."
So that's why we have Rob, Cynthia. That's why we have Rob.
I know. Hit the dump button. So glad it's not like
That's brilliant.
So look, I think like it really depends. So, you know, if the cultures are close, it's going to be, you're going to think it's all fine. And so Australia to the States is something you see where people get it wrong a lot, because they think, oh, Australia and the States. I've watched all the sitcoms. I know how it works, and they don't. And they find that it's really different. But then people get way too freaked out that, am I doing things wrong? And they get all uncomfortable and screwed up about it. But I don't think it's overplayed. Look, I don't think it's overplayed. I'm even thinking of somebody that I know really well who's about to hire a bunch of Germans into his organization at a very senior level. And he's going to mix them in with a bunch of British people. And he's like, how is this going to go? And my recommendation is, doesn't matter if they're senior execs, nobody can be too proud. Get in there and do some cross-cultural training. Get everybody, train them separately, and then get them to sit down. Look, we do this with clients. I mean, I don't do as much cross-cultural stuff as I used to in terms of bespoke projects. But when we do, I try and get the teams to actually get together and have that uncomfortable conversation about, what do we find weird about you and what do we really not like about working with you? Because I think, you know, if you can get in there and talk about that, quite frankly, it breaks down a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But the thing is, we see things so differently, and we need to just be okay with that and just try and understand where other people are coming from.
Yeah, completely agree. And that example that you've given of the training for the cultural training for the German and the British teams, we had a German guy who was married locally to a Northern Irish girl, and it was brilliant. He did a little sketch for us, highlighting in a comedic way all of the differences and the assumed, you know, we make so many assumptions, but all of the differences between the Northern Irish and the German. And it was just brilliant. It was done just really cleverly, but in that 2 or 3 minutes, it really illuminated for us the differences. And that leads me on to thinking about the mode of entry. And this was certainly something that we tried. Distributors, we even created a franchise model. We had agents, we had introducers, and after, I suppose, 15 years, we realized actually what we need to do is establish a local presence. And I would have, we would have benefited significantly of having advice and guidance around how we should shortcut that? What were the things to look out for?
Yeah.
So what would you recommend in terms of getting to know your mode of entry for a new market, Cynthia?
Well, look, I think you've got to think about, firstly, what is your risk appetite? Because there's a whole scale, from e-commerce at the very low end to like setting up a greenfield factory at the very far end, a whole bunch of stuff in between. But you've got to think about, what is our appetite for risk? Because that's going to inform what you do. What is our capacity? How much time do we have to spend on this? Because like so many other things, it's a trade-off. If you can get distributor relationships can be hard to get right, but if you can get them right, suddenly you've got somebody with 50 staff who can do hundreds or even thousands of meetings on your behalf in your target market each year, as opposed to your company where there are one or two of you and you're flying there once or twice or three times a year and trying to scramble around, and maybe you can get, 36 meetings a year. So I think, especially for the early stages, distributors can be good if you get it right. But the problem is so many people think that distributors are kind of set and forget. Hey, I'll get a distributor and then they'll sell our stuff, and they come back 12 months later and they're like, this damn distributor, what do distributors even do? They're taking 40% of margin, and are they even doing anything? And I mean, it's like any relationship. Your distributor is effectively part of your team. Think of it if you were dating them. If you sort of started to go out with somebody and then you didn't bother to call them for 6 months, your relationship would probably not be that great, and you probably wouldn't be getting that much out of it. So that's just kind of like a bit of a thought bubble on distributors. But I think it's about what's your risk, what's your capacity, how much money do you have, is the pricing model going to work for that market? So, if you're an ultra premium product and you're selling it several 100% what it costs to produce, and you can have a distributor and they can, put your stuff into major stores, for example, maybe that could be really, really good. If you're something that's much more mass market and you're not making massive margins, and you discover that in that jurisdiction you're going to, the distributor is going to take 40%, that could be a huge issue. So the answer is it really depends. And it's this process of thinking, what are our options? And then looking at each option and saying, how well can this apply to us? And then if we're going to pick this one, what do we actually need to do to make it work?
Yeah, again, it relates so closely with our own experience. Initially, we were flattered by approaches from potential distributors, again, very reputable distributors, and we kind of went into that and some of those relationships quite blindly in terms of what these distributors would likely do for us. And I've never heard that term set and forget. There was certainly a little bit of that with ourselves in terms of, look, they've now got our product, we've given them some training, just kind of get on with it. And ultimately, we found that our most successful mode of entry was to establish locally, especially that given the distributor wanted us to commoditize the product. And really what we were selling was something bespoke. And it was only through that journey that we discovered actually if we continue with this relationship, our USP is likely to be diluted to the point where we're no longer competitive in the marketplace. So
I was going to say, I've got a favorite client, which is a pharmaceutical company down here that sells skin products in Australia, but also a lot of other places in the world. More than 50% of their turnover is now made up of international markets. And what their CEO says, and he is third generation in the company, is that they found that distributors are a great place to start, but that as the company matures, you kind of want to move on from it, because the distributor won't always represent the brand the way that you want it to be represented. And at the end of the day, when you can, you should take it over so you can represent the company's brand the way the company wants it represented in that market.
Yeah, and that was certainly our experience, and the distributors were very conscious of that as well. So, there's that almost jockeying initially to say, look, are they really invested in us as a distributor? And, should we dedicate resource to developing this product? And, once we get it developed, are they likely to actually step away from us? So, again, back to the relationship piece and the importance of investing time and effort in those relationships. Again, from our own experience, we found that so critically important. I suppose if we go right back to the start of this, why do you feel it's important for SMEs to consider expanding internationally?
Well, if you come from a small market like Ireland or Australia, you're going to cap out at like, well, down here it's 25 million people, and in Ireland it's a little bit less than that.
Yeah.
And so, if you want to be able to sell to people elsewhere, if you want to be able to, I like to think of it in terms of impact. If you want to amplify your impact, especially if you sell something, if you sell clean water or health services or something that can really change people's lives, if you want to make that impact and really make a big change for the better in the world, you need to do it outside your own backyard.
Yeah, completely agree. And again, it aligns with our desire to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of SMEs to scale with purpose. And when they have developed a wonderful product and or service, I feel it's incumbent on them actually to take it beyond their borders. And again, given our location in Ireland, that just seems to be natural in our DNA. We have a market of 6 million people totally, and we're an island, so it just seems natural. But as we move into other countries where maybe exporting is not as common, let's say, there's a requirement to change an existing paradigm. So yeah, I was just curious to get your take on that, Cynthia. In closing, and before we get into the timeless takeaways, the question that I always pose to our guests, I mean, you've now your own company, Dearin Associates. How have you found that, and what have been the key components, do you think, of your own success in scaling Dearin Associates?
Oh, I think just being bloody minded and extremely stubborn, because anybody who started a company will know it is no picnic. So I think you have to have an idea that you really believe in. You have to be smart about it, and you just have to keep showing up day after day. Even though, there are times when there are a lot of days that you kind of think, I actually am not sure if I want to show up for this anymore, because inevitably you hit plateaus and roadblocks and periods of fog where you're just really not sure what you should do. So I think it is not for people who want a super easy life. But when you see it coming right, it's immensely rewarding. So I think it's for a certain personality type, and you have to really want it, to be honest. I mean, I like it because over time, as I've learned how to get better at managing my time and managing my team, it has let me create, a life I want, where I don't have to work full time anymore. And in the season of life that I'm in, where I've got little kids, I can actually work a reasonable amount, but I can actually spend a reasonable chunk of the week being there for them and raising them and being the parent that I want to be.
Brilliant. And just on that, Psyche is the first principle within our 10 principle Scale X framework. Is there anything that you can share with the listeners in terms of what you do to develop a robust psyche, a robust mindset?
Well, I think it comes back to your worldview, right? I think, how you see the world and, and what you believe about yourself and the world has a huge role to play in that. So, I'm Christian, and my worldview is informed by that. I believe that I'm a created being with a special place in the world who is loved, even despite my failings. And even though sometimes I look at what I've done, I'm like, wow, that kind of sucks. And so that really helps me get back up from when I fail, because I think, how I see myself is not necessarily the most important thing. So I think for me, that is really important. I'm also really blessed that I've got family and friends around me who support me and back me up. And, even when I have those days when I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exhausting, they're like, no, it's okay. Just don't think about that now. Have a decent sleep. You'll be fine tomorrow. So, those things are all really helpful.
Yeah. And certainly you mentioned at the outset, connecting and building strong relationships within the professional board. I think that's equally important within your own personal life, and create your own personal board, those trusted people around you, that network.
Absolutely. Well, there's no point, like, you can have all the money and success in the world, right? But if the relationships are shot, there's not really a lot of point. So I think, the relationships and caring for those people around you really have to come first, and that kind of stuff, and family and looking at the other areas of your life really help keep the kind of I think the mania and obsession that often grips entrepreneurs, speaking for myself, I think it helps to keep it in check, because you look at the other stuff and you're like, all right, well, it is important, but it's not the be all and end all. And there are other things, you know, that are equally important that I need to make space for in my life. So I think balance is difficult, but super important.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote from Cameron Hurrell when I interviewed him a number of weeks ago, and said, it's a Rumi quote. He said, at the end of the day, we're just walking each other home. So
yeah, pretty much.
It's important to remind ourselves of that in all of this. Given the extent of your wonderful career, and you know, you're in many respects only at the start of that with Dearin Associates, Cynthia, what are the 3 timeless takeaways that you would leave our listeners with today?
Is it around scaling business internationally, do you think?
It can be anything.
Oh, look, I think if it's for yourself, you know, if you have an idea and you really think it can work, just believe in it, and, you know, believe that you can actually do it. Don't doubt yourself. I think self-doubt is a huge enemy. So, you know, believe that you can do it. I think my 2 for international business would just be, you need to do your research. There's no point trying to scale a business internationally and do it in an ad hoc way. That way lies disaster, or is it that way disaster lies? One of those 2. And then thirdly, when it comes to dealing with people from other places in international business, my top tip would just be always try and stand in the other person's shoes. Like, take a beat before you respond and just say, you know, okay, I feel really upset about what just happened, or that was really inappropriate, or how rude, and just think, hang on, what's the other person experiencing right now? What are they seeing? Is the way I'm about to respond going to be helpful to this situation, or should I just shut up and count to 1,000?
I love those. So, you know, belief is so critically important. What we can conceive and believe, we ultimately can achieve. As Jim Rohn famously said, do your research and learn to stand in the other person's shoes. And I would signpost people to a wonderful YouTube clip. We actually put a little post in the show notes. I think it's called the Empathy Museum, where you can go to a place in Europe and literally take a person's shoes, and with a set of headphones, listen to that person's voice and walk around for an hour. So I
love it. I'm going.
So you've all sorts of strange views of 6'5", heavily set men walking about in a pair of females' high heels, and listening to their stories, so and getting a real sense of what it is to literally walk in their shoes. So I love that. What's next for you, Cynthia? Is there another book in the offing?
Not yet. My husband's going to kill me. I told him I was going to write one book on each chapter, because I'm like, there's not really enough detail on this. He just looked horrified. He's like, stop. Not yet. So we're launching the new book next week in Australia. Don't know if we'll launch it anywhere else yet. We'll see. Look, for now, I have enough to do. I'm going to just keep building my company and raising my family.
Brilliant.
And taking care of the people around me. You can ask me again in a couple of years. I'll probably be, you know, looking around for new projects by then. But for now, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
Brilliant. And look, for anyone who wants to reach you, Cynthia, where best?
LinkedIn. You can always get me in there every single day. Cynthia Dearin. I think there's only one of me, as far as I know. So that's the place. The Cynthia Dearin page on Facebook. If you prefer Facebook, you can find me there. And you can find me on Twitter at Cynthia Dearin. So those are 3 great places. And if you hate social media, then send me an email, firstname.lastname @DearinAssociates.com.
Brilliant. Cynthia, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. I've really enjoyed having you on the show. The very best of luck with everything you're doing.
Thanks, Brendan.